back, everyone, to Poetry Revival. My name is AJ. I'm your host. If you have trouble remembering the name AJ, just think of Aunt Jemima, the former pancake syrup maker. These days, people frown on the idea of a black woman entrepreneur, so Aunt Jemima is no longer a thing. However, it's still in the collective memory, so we can talk about it here just fine. Don't call me Aunt Jemima, though. I am not a 65-year-old black woman living in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Today's episode, this is episode 5, and it is called Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, the finest analysis forevermore. I am glad and grateful to be recording this podcast on Canadian soil in Nanaimo, BC, where April is Poetry Appreciation Month. And I'm glad to be finally putting more content onto this channel, even though it's not the episode I had been intending to put on this channel next. I have to wait for a program to become affordable so that I can buy that program and recreate the content that I need for that episode. It's like 98% done. I just need a new program. It's very costly. So I'm waiting for that. And when I get that, then I'll be able to produce that episode there. It has to do with the different types of poetry, according to Aristotle. So we'll get into that. But today, in honor of Poetry Appreciation Month in Canada, we are going to dig through the entirety of Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, which is one of the most famous poems in the English language in the world. A beloved poem all over the place, and rightfully so. The Raven is of special importance to my channel because, frankly, I have heard so many actors recite the poem, but the way they recite it indicates to me that they don't quite understand what Edgar Allan Poe was trying to say when he wrote the poem. Some lines are just recited with some awkwardness that shows that they don't get it. So that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about here. But some of these actors include just great actors, every one of them. Vincent Price, John Delancey, John Aston, James Earl Jones, Christopher Walken, and Christopher Lee. These people have all recited the poems, beautifully acted. The emoting is perfect in each case, but the emphasis shows that they don't know what they're really saying, and that is a drawback of the recitation of the poem. And of course, I've also heard this with students when they recite the poem as well. It's a little bit worse in that case. Less mature readers with a less mature understanding of how to recite, plus the fact that they don't understand what they're saying. So that becomes quite cumbersome. So I want to walk everyone through this poem step by step. How are we going to get there? Well, here's the itinerary. First of all, we're going to begin by briefly exploring the academic basics of the structure of the poem of The Raven. We're going to look at the rhythm, the meter, the rhyme scheme, blah, 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 blah. After that, we're going to explore the meaning of the poem, verse by verse, line by line as necessary. And I'll highlight some of the more difficult ideas, little-known terms, and that type of thing as we go through it that way. After that, I'm going to review the rules for reading a poem that I introduced to you in episode 2 of this channel, so that we can refresh your mind on how to read a poem and make understanding out of it. Because, to be quite honest, the school system has done an awful job since the early 1900s with teaching poetry. I personally think that it has sucked. It was a detriment to me, and I know it was also a detriment to my dad. And in one event, it even caused my dad and me to have a stained relationship because I'm a poet, and he told me any number of times how much he hates poetry, and all because he had a lousy literature teacher. So I'm going to begin the academic analysis now. If this part doesn't interest you, I want you to feel free to skip ahead. I will put a red flag for 3 or 4 seconds up on the screen to let you know when to start listening again when the academic part is over. It should be about, I'm guessing, 10 minutes, but I really don't know. Okay, this is an examination of the construction of a poem only. It has nothing to do with how you recite or read or understand a poem. It's only how the poet has constructed it. And how the poet constructs it really has nothing to do with how a reader reads it. Now, examining the construction of the poem gives you an idea of how a poem will look, or how a stanza will look. But it gives no indications whatsoever of the beauty of the language that it uses or any of that. It's like the frame of a house. Just beginning construction on a house and they get the wooden frame up. That's it. That's what the construction of a poem is. You don't get any idea about what the actual poem says or does. It's just, here is how it's constructed. Okay, so there are 18 stanzas in the Raven. All of these stanzas have the identical construction, one from the next. But there is not a hint of any form of mass production in the poem. Despite the fact that they are constructed exactly the same, each stanza stands out completely different from all the others. So think of it like 18 houses on a street, all with exactly the same construction, the same frame, but they all look completely different. That's the job of the poet. They're going to be different colors. They're going to have different types of shingles on the roof. They're going to have different people living inside of them, different kinds of families, different sizes of families. They're going to have different decorations. All of these things are important. But right now we are just looking at the frame of each house. And to do that, we're going to look at just one stanza and examine that for its construction. So we are going to talk about how they are constructed similarly. This is the poet's job, not the reader's. So I'm going to start. Let me just read the first stanza. And I'm going to read it without any artistic expression, just to emphasize the certain parts of the poem. This is the first stanza of The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Okay, so the first thing we note is that you have 6 lines in each stanza. The first 5 of those lines are in what is called trochaic octameter. What does that mean? Octameter means that there are 8 stressed syllables in each line. And that's the most important thing about a meter of a poem, is the number of stressed syllables. The fact that it's trochaic indicates that the syllables are in pairs and that the first syllable of each pair is stressed in its construction, not in the way it's read. So the first line of The Raven, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. The first, third, fifth, and 7th syllables in each line is stressed. The even-numbered syllables are all unstressed. If it were the reverse, that would be called iambic, and it would sound more like this in its construction. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. And you can see that it's very awkward because the way it's constructed becomes very natural. It's very natural for the first and third and fifth and 7th syllables to be stressed. Reversing that takes away that natural flow of the language, because that's not how it's constructed. Each word has a certain rhythm of its own. All right, so that's trochaic octameter. When you try to remember trochaic, it's a strange word, and I wish I knew the etymology. Bothered looking it up, but to help you remember it, think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is itself trochaic, but it also begins with a T. At least that'll help you differentiate it between trochaic and iambic. Iambic is the opposite of trochaic. In iambic, you still have syllables paired, but the first one is unstressed in each line, and the second syllable is stressed. And each pair of syllables in both rhythms is called a foot. So each line in Poe's poem here is going to have 8 feet, so it's 8 feet long. but that doesn't have anything to do with inches. It has to do with number of paired syllables. Same with this, if it's something in iambic. Each pair of syllables is a foot. Iambic starts with unstressed, and sonnets are very famous for this type of thing. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Right? If you were to try to reverse that like I did with trochaic, the iambic line would come out like this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And it just feels awkward. And of course it would. Okay, the last line of each stanza is still trochaic, but it's tetrameter, 4 stressed syllables per line. We're going to talk about that later, but it works as a refrain, which is a repeated idea. Now, the next idea that many students have is, well, why did he write every line to be so long? Why didn't he cut some of them in half or something like that? And we will get to that, but we're going to talk about the rhyme scheme first. A rhyme scheme is a series of sequential letters assigned to the rhyme at the end of each line in a poem or in a stanza of a poem, as the case may be. So, in the first stanza of The Raven, the word weary ends line 1. That's your A. If line 2 ended with a rhyme for weary, then that would also be an A. But it doesn't. It's a completely different sound, so we give that a B. Line 3 is a third sound, so we give that a C. And then back down to line 4, which rhymes with the second line, so we go back to a B for that. So the rhyme scheme for each stanza is A, B, C, B, B, B. Let's look at the rhyme for a little bit. Lines 1 and 3 have no mate for the rhyme. The rhyme scheme doesn't even allow for it. A, B, C, B, B, B. So B has all kinds of mates for the rhyme, but lines 1 and 3 are rhymes A and C. No mates. Very interesting. Also, lines 1 and 3 end on unstressed syllables, and that's very important in poetry. When you have a line that ends with an unstressed syllable, it's called a feminine line. By the way, that's the same in classical music as well. When you have a phrase that ends with an unstressed note, that's a feminine ending. So we have 2 feminine endings in each of these poems, on weary and tapping. Then we have masculine rhyme, masculine endings, or if you want to use a musical term, masculine phrases in lines 2, 4, 5, and 6. Lore, door, door, and more. So you have a nice combination of masculine and feminine rhyme, and that makes for a very musical sounding poem all by itself. If you have a poem that is all feminine rhyme or all masculine rhyme, it's not quite as musical. The variation helps a lot. But now, why are the 2 lines with feminine rhyme all by themselves? Why doesn't Poe give them a mate? Well, he does. It's just that we have to introduce another idea of rhyme, and that is internal rhyme versus end rhyme. End rhyme is at the end of each line of a poem. Weary, lore, tapping, door, door, and more. Those are all lines that are end rhyme. When you have internal rhyme, however, you have a word in the middle of a line that rhymes with another word either at the end of that line or another word in the middle of the same line. That's called internal rhyme. And here, Edgar Allan Poe breaks lines 1 and 3 in half using feminine rhyme and internal rhyme. So dreary rhymes with weary, and napping ends with tapping. Those are rhymes, but they're not end rhymes, only because he didn't put them at the end of lines. And he could have. He could have made the stanzas look like this. So now you have an 8-line stanza. You have a rhyme scheme that is A, A, B, C, C, B, B, B. And each line has a rhyme. And that's all fine and dandy. There's no real reason for him to not do that. He could have. and it would have been just fine. But I think what he's trying to look for, perhaps, and this is all me, this is not Poe, this is not anybody else, just AJ. I'm thinking he's trying to get as many different kinds of rhyme into each stanza as possible. And so he's shooting for internal rhyme on purpose. And so you have the 6-line stanzas. We have another kind of rhyme in each stanza, though. It's called identical rhyme. And you have identical rhyme when you use one word that rhymes with its identical word. That's how it gets the name identical rhyme. So in stanza 1, door rhymes with door. That's identical rhyme. Now, mind you, this can be a very cheesy rhyme, but it's not uncommon if it's used well. Now, one of the reasons Poe does it well here is that he's mixing it in with all different kinds of rhyme. You've got feminine and masculine, you've got end and internal rhyme, and then you have identical rhyme. But there are other ways of using identical rhyme. J.R.R. Tolkien uses it in one of his riddles in the dark from The Hobbit. The answer to the riddle is sun shining on daisies. I'm using that as a title to identify this riddle, which is a poem. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in a low place, not in a high place. All the words that rhyme are the same words. Face, face, eye, and place, place. Except you also have face and place that rhyme, and that's clever. I don't think there's a word for that. I think that's a Tolkien invention, and I don't know of a name for identical rhyme that's no longer identical. Even if it did have a name, it's like, who really cares what the name is, as long as you can identify the fact that, oh, yes, it's identical, and yes, it's not identical. Interesting. Tolkien was a genius poet as well, and he's just using this to mess with us, I think. And it does. It messes with me. It's like, well, I can't teach this as easily because you make it difficult. Oh, well, he says. All right. So we have all those different kinds of rhyme. We have end rhyme. We have internal rhyme. We have feminine rhyme. We have masculine rhyme. We have identical rhyme. The identical rhyme is, in fact, masculine, along with lines 2 and 6. So you have lore, door, and more in stanza 1. Now you have to notice also that the last line is half as long as the previous 5, the last line in each stanza. And this functions as a refrain, because each time, I think all 18 times, it ends with the word more. Sometimes that's the end of another word, never more. But here in this case, it's nothing more, but it's still more. And I think that's consistent all the way through the poem. Okay, so that is an examination of the first stanza of The Raven. At this point, I'm going to read the poem in its entirety for analysis. We're going to go through it stanza by stanza, line by line, as it takes, and we're going to talk about each stanza, each line, each word, and see what it means. All right? So, let me put on the red flag to get people back. All right, well, if you skipped out on the academic analysis of the first stanza of The Raven, welcome back. If you were attentive all the way through that analysis, well, welcome still. We're going to look through each stanza now and talk about it as much detail as we can. If I skip over something that you have a question about, feel free to leave that question in the comments. I will do my best to respond to them as quickly as I can. So, this is The Raven, just going through it for meaning. Stanza 1. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, Suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more." All right, line number 2. Over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. What might these volumes of forgotten lore be? I'm not going to answer that question just yet for my own interpretation. And by the way, you can disagree with me if you have something better. Just make sure you can support it with the text. It could be medieval tales. It could be the Bible. It could be the Quran. It could be any number of religious texts, or it could be some very old primitive medical books. The fact that it's lore suggests that it might be a literary type of thing, or it could be a little bit more mystical. But we're not talking about something here that is necessarily contemporary with the narrator, or is it like a biography or something like that? That wouldn't be lore. Going on to line 6. Only this and nothing. The first thing that Poe does is establish the fact that the narrator is frightened. We don't quite understand why in the first stanza. But there's a problem with the word muttered, I agree. But he is trying to keep himself calm after he's nearly napping and then he hears somebody tapping at his door. He's actually freaking out just a bit. Now, the word muttered there, people say, well, he was so groggy that he really didn't know what he was saying. Oh, somebody at my door. I don't think that that's the meaning that really works. The word muttered is simply a rhythmical choice for a word that means spoke without really realizing what you're saying. I think that's what's going on there. Don't let that word throw you off, though, because it's very clear elsewhere that the narrator is afraid, right off from the first stanza. The word mutter seems to undermine that idea. Don't let it, unless, of course, you have a well-grounded interpretation that disagrees with mine, and you're okay with that. In fact, I salute you if you do. Going onward, stanza 2. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here, forevermore. All right, line 8. And each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Okay, you've got an allusion there to the fact that there's a fire going. It is, after all, December, so it's cold outside. It doesn't say it's snowing or anything like that anywhere in the text, but it's December, and probably in New England. So I'm guessing it would be somewhere in the northern areas where it would be quite chilly. Line 9. He refers to that forgotten lore from the first stanza. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books. That's the books that are the volumes of forgotten lore. He's referring to the first stanza there again. And he wanted to borrow from them surcease of sorrow. What does that mean, surcease? That means an end of. He wants the sorrow to cease. The word surcease is not used much anymore. It has been lost, and quite frankly, I think it's kind of a redundant word. If I were to be writing this today, I would have said, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books a cease of sorrow. Or I would have just skipped the word cease altogether. He likes the S's, I'm guessing, in that line. Books, an end of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore. We learn in this line also that he's missing someone named Lenore. Someone who is very important to him. We don't know the relationship. We assume that it's Mrs. Narrator. Incidentally, you never assume that the person speaking the poem is the poet. You must make that person in the poem separate from the writer. That applies to poetry and fiction of all sorts as well. It does not apply to biographies. So the narrator, the persona, the speaker, has lost this person named Lenore, refers to her as a rare and radiant maiden, which usually indicates that she's a virgin. And I think that's more of a complimentary thing here. I don't think it's necessarily the literal maiden idea, virgin, especially if it's the narrator's wife. I think it's referring more to the fact that she's pure. After all, the angels name her Lenore. So there's a purity about her, but there's great affection and love that the narrator has for this woman. That's one thing that makes the idea of her being his wife credible. There's more, but that's one thing. Let's go on to the next stanza. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Okay. He's clearly frightened here. Now, the word thrilled, again, that undermines the idea of scare. But you have to think of thrilled here as more of a surprise. Something that was very sudden and very unexpected. Filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So this is a new sensation for him. This is scared beyond what he's ever experienced before. Very intriguing. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door." Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. That it is, and nothing more. The word entreating means begging, asking for, trying to get a request responded to. I do think there's an interesting pun on the word late. I don't want to go into a great deal of detail about it now, but late means it's late in the evening, once upon a midnight dreary, some late visitor. But in the context of my interpretation of this poem, it also suggests perhaps not just tardy, but perhaps also deceased. That it is, and nothing more. Next stanza. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, or "Madame, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. All right. Not a lot here that's too obscure to talk about. The word implore, however, is rather obscure in our time. It means the same thing as entreat, to ask, to beg, to request. So truly your forgiveness I ask you. Next stanza. Okay, so darkness there and nothing more. Next stanza. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. All right, so he's staring out into the dark here, and the cold, no doubt. Long I stood there wondering, fearing. So he's still afraid, and he's doubting. What's he doubting? And dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. That word doubting is actually very important. Can't get to that yet, though, not too loudly. But the silence was unbroken, the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. Lenore is this person the narrator is missing so desperately. Another reason to think that it might be the narrator's wife. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore. Notice that the first time it's a question. When the echo comes back, it has an exclamation mark. It's a statement. an emphatic statement. Why does he call the name Lenore? By this point, you should know who or what he's afraid of and why. If you don't, reread it. But I don't want to give it away, at least not yet. All right, next stanza. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. This is the second time he's heard the tapping. Surely, said I, talking to himself, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Here we go again. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. He's still scared, he's still startled. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. How many times when you're scared have you heard or thought or read in scary stories, that's just the wind? It's the same thing here. He's trying to calm himself down. Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but, with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Okay, some words. Stately means elegant, imperial, something like that. It's there's a degree of the austere about it, if it's stately. The word yore, the stately days of yore. It's kind of a literary way, a poetic way of saying long ago. Not the least obeisance made he. Obeisance is deference, reverence, submission. Mild worship, perhaps, would be the best way to describe the word obeisance. But with mien of lord or lady, mien, M-I-E-N, the word mien means his general overall appearance, his expression, the way he presented himself. With mien of lord or lady. The bust of Pallas. Okay, a bust is a statue, usually from the shoulders up. Sometimes, yes, it's true, it's from the bust up. So a bust of a bust. Pallas, the bust of Pallas, is Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. Pallas Athena was her full name. So it's a ballad bust of the goddess of wisdom. Interesting that that's where the raven perched, though. There's symbolism there. I'll let you think about that on your own. Next stanza. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. All right, what's happening here? Well, let's talk about these words first. Ebony is a very dense, dark wood. Usually it's a heavy brown color, but the more oftentimes you see it, it's actually black. I think that is actually a stain they use on it. But if you see a violin or cello or double bass, the fingerboard, the long black piece of wood that's where the musician presses the strings to make a pitch, that's the fingerboard that's made of ebony, and it's usually a very dark black. And there's another piece down at the bottom that holds the other end of the strings. That's called a tail piece, and that's also made of ebony. Very heavy, dense wood. So then this ebony bird beguiling. Beguiling means bewitching or seducing, delighting, distracting, or fascinating. This bird's got his attention, making him smile. Beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Then he starts talking to the bird here. And this is another place where people get it wrong. They want to pause with the quote after shaven, and that doesn't work. He's actually saying, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven. And people often read it as though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, as though thou starts a new sentence or something. It's really odd. But the thought is, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, interjection, I said, art sure no craven. Craven is a word that means coward in this case, because it's used as a noun. It's more often used as an adjective, though. Craven self-interest, cowardly self-interest. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore, very dark outside. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Plutonian refers to something that's dark, depressing, and desolate, perhaps even stormy. Quoth the raven, nevermore. What's happening here? Okay, imagine you are walking down a street and you see a stray black cat. And it walks up to you and purrs and starts rubbing itself against your leg, and you squat down and you start petting him. What's the first thing you say to that cat? You say, "Oh, you're a sweet kitty cat. What's your name?" Why a person insists on asking a cat's name is beyond me. People do it with dogs and squirrels and all kinds of animals. Why they think the animal would respond is beyond me. But in this case, the animal does. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Imagine if that happened. What would that do to you if you were talking to an animal? Thinking, well, it's not going to respond. I'm just talking to the animal to be friendly. And it does respond. You know, you say, "Oh, what's your name, you cute little kitty cat?" "Death to Biden!" Right? Something like that. Imagine how you would react. That would be a shocker. That's what happens here. Much I marvel this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. Okay, the word ungainly means awkward, clumsy, bumbling is the one I like. And I find this line ironic, because if the bird is bumbling, it's odd that the narrator would hear discourse so plainly. In other words, this bird that he calls ungainly, he also says is speaking very clearly. That doesn't sound bumbling to me. Keep on going here. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. All right. Placid means calm, tranquil, peaceful, serene. What's happening here? That's all the bird has said. He just said, oh, what's your name? Nevermore. Oh, and that's all the bird says. And then the guy is thinking, oh, he's not going anywhere. That's okay. He can be up there for tonight. Tomorrow he's going to be gone anyway. I'll just leave the window open. And then the bird immediately, as though responding, says, nevermore. This freaks the guy out. In fact, if you look at that last line of that stanza, then the bird said nevermore. Generally, when you have a sentence like that, there should be a comma after the word said. But Edgar Allan Poe leaves that comma out as if to add to the idea of the immediacy of that statement. It's not, then the bird said nevermore. It's, then the bird said nevermore. It's like, holy Toledo. This bird is responding to me. And that's what's going through the narrator's mind. The narrator is pointing out the very well-timed response of the raven to his own inward comment. This is weird. And the narrator is responding to that. Startled by the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock in store. Caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore. Till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of nevermore. Okay, the word that is something I want to talk about in this line. This is another one of those places where people get lost, especially those actors that I told you about, but students as well. The word that can mean which, meaning you're referring to this and just making sure whoever's listening to you knows which one you're talking about. This is simply the way the line is constructed. The word that is applying specificity. Till the dirges of his hope, that melancholy burden bore. Which melancholy burden? Never, nevermore. Till the dirges of his hope, that melancholy burden bore. Of never, nevermore. You know, the refrain in that stanza is almost unneeded, except that it's a refrain, so it has to be there. Next stanza. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, that's the velvet of the chair, okay, the cushioned seat that he just wheeled in front of the bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy into fancy, okay. So he's trying to figure this out. Linking fancy into fancy is just a nice poetic way of saying, I'm just going to try to figure this thing out here. Thinking, what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press. This is where the poem starts to turn and begins to build toward its climax. He has been thinking about the bird, talking about the bird, kind of getting a chuckle from the bird. Then he sits in this chair, which apparently may have been Lenore's, and suddenly he starts lamenting the fact that she's not going to sit there anymore. She's not going to press that velvet violet lining, and he laments that. Nevermore, maybe even beginning to sob. That is almost symbolic, almost suggestive of a whimper, perhaps. The word she definitely refers to Lenore, though. There's no doubting that. There's no disputing that. Going on. Then methought meaning I thought. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer. A censer is an incense burner that's suspended from the hand by 3 chains. You'll usually see a Catholic priest walking down an aisle swinging this censer back and forth. It's got incense in it. It's burning, smoke coming from it. That's a censer. Perfumed by an unseen censer, swung by seraphim, not by the Pope, but by seraphim. Those are angels. Archangels, spirit, angel, that's the references there. Whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Okay, tufted floor, what is that? It's a 19th century version of a carpeted floor. That's what it is. Why are the footfalls tinkling? Well, because the tufted floor would make footfalls so silent that if you had a servant, you wouldn't be able to hear the servant approaching as you would if it were on wooden floors or tile floors. So the servants wore bells. Almost the exact same thing as, who will tie the bell around the old cat's tail so we'll know when he's around the house? It's that type of thing. the servants would wear bells on their feet so that the owners of the house, the masters, would know when the servants are approaching. In this case, though, the angels are approaching, and their footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. The tufted floor also suggests a degree of wealth on the part of the narrator. I don't think, it doesn't sound like he has servants, but he has this tufted floor, and the seraphim, I think, are kind of a unique thing as well. So he's freaking out at this point. Then he cries to himself, "Wretch," I cried, "thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite." Respite is a break or a pause. Think of it as an intermission, usually in something that is difficult to handle. I mean, you don't take a respite from sleeping. You take a respite from hard work. Respite and nepenthe. And yes, that is how it's pronounced. Nepenthe is a tranquilizer, a sedative. My research also says it's an analgesic, but I really don't know what an analgesic is, so I didn't look that up. But I will assume it has something to do with relieving pain, because that's what you take when you have a headache. All right. Respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff. Oh, quaff this kind nepenthe. Quaff means to drink it quickly. Gulp. Quickly drain. Quaff, oh, quaff this kind nepenthe and forget the lost Lenore. Okay. In other words, I'm going to get a respite from my sorrow, from this anguish that I feel, from remembering Lenore all the time. She's always in the front of my brain. And the raven says, no, you're not. At least that's how the narrator thinks the raven is sounding. The raven's just saying his only word. Nevermore. The raven doesn't know what he's saying. But the narrator thinks that the raven is responding to the narrator's own personal commentary. Probably not, but that's what the narrator thinks. So, what does the narrator say? Now remember, this is twice that the raven has seemingly responded to personal commentary on the part of the narrator. And so, the narrator's saying, okay, fine. Obviously, you know what you're talking about. So, the next stanza. Prophet, said I, thing of evil. Prophet still if bird or devil. So, prophet is a seer, is a spokesman for God, or a spokesbird for God. Think of Baal's donkey who spoke to him. Now, the tempter or the temptest, easily here. A tempter is, we're talking about the devil, Satan, or just evil in general. And the tempest is a storm. I think that word really has influenced the rest of my understanding of the poem, because I'm always seeing a storm when I'm reading the early part of this poem. And the Plutonian shore, those two together, influence my whole impression of the entire poem. The tempest is a storm, but what he's saying here is that either you are sent here by design, whether tempter sent, or by chance, or tempest tossed thee here ashore. So he's not saying, okay, you're either here from Satan or the storm specifically. He's saying you are here by someone's design, or you're here by chance. It doesn't make any difference at this point. He doesn't care. Whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted. Once again, tell me truly, I implore, I beg of you. So he's saying, okay, I don't care anymore if you're from the devil, or if somebody has designed you to be here, or if you're just an accident. You made it here, and this is a really dreadful time for me, so I'm going to ask you, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, what's balm in Gilead? Okay, a balm is something that you put on to soothe a wound. Gilead is a reference to an area of Israel. And this whole thing is a reference to the Bible and to Israel. We need to go to Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. Let me read that. This is what that passage in the Bible says. Keep in mind the attitude of the narrator as I read this passage. My grief is beyond healing. My heart is broken. Listen to the weeping of my people. can be heard all across the land. Has the Lord abandoned Jerusalem? The people ask. Is her king no longer there? Oh, why have they provoked my anger with their carved idols and their worthless foreign gods, says the Lord. Okay, so in that first part, the people are speaking. Then the Lord answers, but he's not answering them. It's his own thoughts redirected. The harvest is finished and the summer is gone, the people cry, yet we are not saved. So this is back to the people talking. I hurt with the hurt of my people. This is the prophet talking. This man is a prophet. This is Jeremiah. And now he's saying, I'm identifying with the people here. They're crying, they're hurt, they're sad, they're scared. I hurt with the hurt of my people. I mourn and am overcome with grief. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why is there no healing for the wounds of my people? And then I have a note here. Gilead is a specific mountainous area east of the River Jordan in Israel, part of the biblical promised land. So he is, whether the bird is or not, he doesn't really care. He is going to take the idea of that bird being a prophet just so he can get some answers. And just like the text in Jeremiah, the narrator in both passages are in anguish. And they're looking for some kind of resolution, some kind of closure from not just the loss, not just the end of the relationship with the person, or in this case, the land and the people, but the pain that's associated with it. This is all very important. Next stanza, the narrator repeats himself, to begin with anyway. Prophet, said I, thing of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil. By that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore. Remember, we just came out of a reference to the Bible. So if he's talking about balm in Gilead, it makes sense that he would suddenly talk about the God we both adore. It doesn't make sense on a logical level that if he's thinking of this bird as the tempter, as Satan, that he would think that God is the God that we both adore. That doesn't make sense. But I think he's trying to suck up to the bird a little bit with that. Prophet, said I, thing of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil. By that heaven that bends above us. By that God we both adore. Tell this soul with sorrow laden if, within the distant Aden, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. All right, laden means burdened, hampered, oppressed, or even overtaxed. The word Aden, as I understand it, is actually Edgar Allan Poe's invention. He's simply looking for a rhyme with laden, and so he's using the word Eden from the Bible, E-D-E-N, but he's putting a different pronunciation to it to make it rhyme, to make it clear that he's still making biblical references here. But also it sounds a little bit more mystical, mythical even, to talk about Aden rather than Eden. Tell this soul with sorrow laden if, within the distant Aden, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. These two lines are quoted from earlier in the poem. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, what's he asking here? Tell this person who's really sad, am I going to see Lenore again in the afterlife? And the raven says no. At least, that's what the narrator thinks the raven is saying. I think the raven is probably just saying what the raven has always been saying because that's what the raven knows to say. I was just watching a video of a raven the other day. It was standing next to a guy with a little child's xylophone, the little metal ones, the ting, 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 ting. And the guy would play a phrase on this little xylophone, ting, 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 ting. And the raven would go, ah. The guy would give the bird a treat. And then he'd go, ting, 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 ting. And the bird would go, ah. And the guy would give the bird a treat. And so every time the guy paused on his little xylophone thingy, the bird would go, ah, and he'd get a treat. That's what's happening here with this raven. The guy stops talking, so the raven says, nevermore. But that's not what the narrator thinks. The narrator thinks this raven is telling him, no, you're never going to see Lenore again. That means that heaven will never really be heaven for him as far as he's taking it. That means that heaven is hell. In other words, the raven is saying in the afterlife, you're not going to be in heaven, you're going to hell. Or, depending on how you interpret it, you're not going to see Lenore because she's in hell. And if you go to heaven, you're not going to see her. And even if you are in hell with her, you'll never see her again. Past the end. That's very bleak. How does the narrator respond? He freaks the heck out, is how he responds. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. In other words, I don't believe what you're saying because I don't want to believe it. Not that there's any evidence. I mean, if the bird's a prophet, the bird's a prophet, right? But he's choosing to not believe the bird. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, ain't gonna happen. Nevermore. One whole stanza to go. And that was the climax of the poem. So this whole rest is the resolution. And the raven, never flitting, never moving at all, still is sitting on the pallid. What's pallid? Pallid is pale, pasty, or ashen. Plaster color, or pale marble in color. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Okay. In other words, whether he's in heaven or hell is irrelevant at this point for him. He's never going to be happy again. The raven has so impacted him that whether the raven leaves or not, there's always going to be that presence, a shadow. And the narrator is saying, I'm never going to know happiness or joy again. Whether that means he's insane at this point is up to interpretation. Some people have even suggested maybe he's now demon-possessed. Again, completely up to interpretation. I just see it as he's resolved to never be happy again. That's what he thinks the raven has told him. I do like the idea here in line 105. His eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now that's an example of a word I just learned, and I was so excited to see it in here when I was doing this analysis. The word is anastrophe, which is the intentional jumbling of words poetically for the sake of rhyme or for the sake of rhythm in a poem. Yoda is very famous for anastrophe. He does not speak the same way other people around him do, but they still make sense. They're still used in such a way that it can be understood, but it's not conventional. That's anastrophe. And that's the poem. So now I'm going to start reading the poem dramatically, but before I do, I want to go back and review the rules for reciting a poem and doing it so that you can appreciate it, you can understand it. These rules are from episode 2 of this podcast. If you want to go back and listen to episode 2, that's fine, but it's a quick summary of those rules. How to read a poem. Rule number 1. Forget everything you've learned about what you have read prior to what I'm telling you. And that's because they all tell you the same thing. Read the poem and look for poetic devices. Okay. Forget that. Don't look for poetic devices. Not yet. The idea being, just enjoy the poem. That's rule number 1. You can look at the devices. That's fun. And it really will help you to dig in and find some extra meaning. Time and time again, especially with great poets like Poe. But don't worry about that when you're getting to know a poem. Just read the poem, get to know it. That's all. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2, be prepared to read a new poem more than once. The longer the poem, the more effort you'll have to put into that. But even if it's just a sonnet, you're not going to understand it reading it one time through, especially if it's a literary quality poem. You're just not going to be able to get it all in depth the first time through. Rule number 3 comes in 2 parts. So 3A is that a sentence is still a sentence even in a poem. The point here is when people read a poem, they stop at the end of the line. And if that end of the line comes in the middle of a sentence, you are thinking the next line is starting a new sentence when it may not be. Part of the problem that introduced that is that poems used to be written so that every line began with an uppercase letter, and that multiplied the problem. In the 20th century, 21st century, you don't have to do that. I don't do it. I hate that rule. But even so, even without that, people still stop at the end of the line because it's the end of the line, apparently. And when they do that in the middle of a sentence, it obscures the thought. And they don't understand what they're reading. Rule 3B just is the same rule except for a different reason. People want to stop when there's rhyme. Da-da-da-da-da-A. Da-da-da-da-da-da-A. Da-da-da-da-da-da-B. Da-da-da-da-da-da-B. But if you read it like that and there's a sentence that's broken into 2 different lines, you're going to lose your meaning. Think of the old poem, I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Okay? Don't stop for the rhyme. Don't pause. Keep going. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. That's how you read it. Pretend the poem has no rhyme. Pretend the line keeps on going. Rewrite it if you have to so that stanza number 1 of The Raven looks like this. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. New paragraph. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. And I underlined the letter that would have been the first letter of each line in the original way it was printed. Here I'm just trying to emphasize, write it out so that you don't have those end lines. Then it'll help train you to read the poem without pausing at the end of each line. I do encourage you to do that with every poem you encounter. I don't care if it's longer than The Raven. It'll help you. And these days, it's so much easier. You can just, copy and paste from the internet and just take out the line feeds. It's so much easier. I do that all the time with new poems. And I've been reading poetry and loving it for, 45 years or more. Rule number 4. Now, this was actually handled in a separate episode from episode 2, but I'll include it here. It is an important one. You need to be able to trust yourself when you read a poem. Your interpretation or your understanding of a poem is equally valid with whatever the author might say about that poem, assuming that the author said anything at all, which may not happen. In fact, normally doesn't happen. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that most people will try to say, well, I really don't know what this means. But by golly, it'd be easy if we could find out what the author says it means. Well, there are all kinds of problems with that to talk about why you just forget what the author intended. Nobody cares. What he or she says about a poem after it is published is irrelevant to your understanding. Read it, understand it for yourself. If you have a line, and this does happen, you get a line or a couple of lines, it's just, I don't know what he's trying to say here. Look up, get some other people's opinions. If you can find the author's opinion, it's just an opinion, but that might help. If you can't, do your best with it. There was one poem for me, Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. There are 3 lines in that poem that I have never understood. Tennyson never said a thing about those lines. Sometimes, when I'm reciting that poem, I just skip over those lines. They don't need to be there. They're not that important. I just pass over them because I don't know what they mean. Now, in a rhymed poem like this, you may not be able to do that as easily. Just give it the meaning you can, but the point is, it's still your interpretation. Your interpretation is yours alone. Go with it. As long as the text supports that interpretation, you are correct. Period. End of discussion. I kid you not. All right. Last rule. Get to know the poem and enjoy it. Read it a number of times. Learn to love it. If this is literature we're talking about here, just read it and reread it and reread it and reread it until you love it, or until you've decided you can't stand it. Whatever the case may be, the idea is that you need to spend some time with it, grow a relationship with it, and learn to either love it or hate it, or just be indifferent, I suppose. That'll work too. So those are the rules regarding reading a poem. So sadly, I'm interjecting this after I finished editing the voiceover, but I forgot to make a very important point. I wanted to wait until an appropriate time to tell you what it is the narrator is afraid of at the opening of the poem, according to my interpretation. Again, you may interpret it entirely differently, and that's valid as long as the text supports what you're saying. My interpretation is this. The lore that he refers to in the first stanza of the poem is spells, witchcraft, tales of how to raise the dead. This is the lore that he is exploring. This is the quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Mind you, it's many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. So he's doing some heavy-duty research. He is trying to raise Lenore from the dead. And while he can't stand living without her, he's still terrified that it might freaking work. Oh my goodness. Now, there are a couple of reasons he might be afraid that it might work. Maybe he murdered her. And if he raises her from the dead, she's going to come back to exact vengeance. Possibly. Or it could just be he's raising her from the dead. What else do you really need? The disciples, when Jesus was raised from the dead, freaked out when they saw him. It was scary for them. They thought they were seeing a ghost. Jesus had to eat bread to prove to them that it was not a ghost they were seeing. It was not some kind of, well, it was supernatural, but it wasn't from lore. It was historical fact. Different type of thing altogether, but they were still afraid. I saw this man die. I saw him get buried, and here he is standing before me and talking to me. That would freak anybody out. And that is what the narrator might also be afraid of. So I'm going to stick this back in with the discussion of the poem right before I start reciting. I hope that it has helped you to understand and appreciate the poem a little bit more. Now, pause here, go get yourself a drink. I'm going to read the entire poem dramatically at this point. And so, anyway, well, get yourself ready for it. I guess that's all I need to say. All right, so I will see you in just a moment with reading the poem. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember brought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or Madame, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Whew, let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched, and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled by the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, Doubtless, said I. What it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking, what this ominous bird of yore? What this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore? This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er. But whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh, quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget the lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil. By that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Thank you all very much for taking the time to check out this video. I do hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it blessed you in some way. I do humbly ask that you please subscribe and click that bell icon and share this video. But more importantly, I just ask that you have a wonderful couple of weeks until the next time I make a video on this particular channel. Until then, be well.